guys, this is Mrs. Foy, and this is a screencast about the circulatory system. So if you're watching this video, then you're probably in my class, and you will have access to the actual Google presentation that has some videos embedded in it. If you would like to have access to this presentation and you're not in my class, then you can feel free to email me. So the circulatory system is basically a system of transport, and the heart is the pump that is going to circulate the blood, and the blood is basically what is carrying the things to the cells that the cell needs to survive, and the blood is taking away the things that the cells dump out when they are for their waste products. And so the heart and the blood and the blood vessels are all called the circulatory system. So where the heart is located is in the thoracic cavity. So you will recognize that this is the, right here is the diaphragm. This is the diaphragm. This is the muscle that separates the thoracic cavity up here from the abdominal cavity below. And in the thoracic cavity, there is a section right in the center that's called the mediastinum, and that is nestled in between the right and left lung, and that is where the heart and the what we call the great. So there are basically two types of blood that we have. We have oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood. So oxygenated blood is actually blood that is carrying oxygen, and deoxygenated blood has very low oxygen, and it's actually carrying a lot of CO2. Oxygenated blood has low CO2 and a lot of oxygen. And there is a protein in blood called hemoglobin, and hemoglobin's job in the red blood cell is to primarily latch onto oxygen. And when it does that, there's a chemical reaction that occurs, and it actually changes color. So this is actually some blood that's oxygenated blood, and you can see that it is brighter red than deoxygenated blood. This is blood that has already dumped off its oxygen in the cells, and it's a little more maroon color. So a lot of times when we teach about this, we show oxygenated blood as red, and we show deoxygenated blood as blue. Even though it is not blue, it is a little bit of a different color, and so you might want to keep that in mind. These are red blood cells. So this is a red blood cell, or RBC, or erythrocyte, and this is a red blood cell. And you can see, we'll talk more about red blood cells later, but this red blood cell has hemoglobin in it that is carrying oxygen right now. So this is oxygenated blood, and this is deoxygenated blood because the hemoglobin is carrying low oxygen and actually high. So the pathway of the blood is in a closed circuit, and coming from the heart, so coming from the heart, we have big blood vessels called arteries, and these are all carrying oxygenated blood with one exception, which we'll learn about in a minute. And these big arteries break down into smaller blood vessels called arterioles, which break into smaller capillaries. When you get to a capillary is so tiny that a red blood cell can only get through there in single file. And what happens in the capillaries is this is where the exchange actually occurs. So oxygen is diffused out of the capillaries and into the cells. You can see the cells here. And the cells use oxygen to be able to make ATPs. And this blood, by the way, is also bringing glucose and other nutrients to the cells. And when the cells are finished making some ATP, they actually give off carbon dioxide. And that is a waste product. And so that goes back into the capillaries. We now say that this blood is deoxygenated because it has dropped off its oxygen load. And these capillaries now form they flow together and flow a little bit bigger blood vessels called venules, and those venules flow together to form veins, and these veins go back to the heart and the lungs where we pick up more oxygen and the heart the cycle. So as I said, we have a closed system, and you can think of the heart in two sides. You can think of the right side of the heart that receives the deoxygenated blood from the body, and this is shown in blue. And so these would all be venules and veins that go back to end up the right side of the heart. So you see we have blood coming from the legs back to the heart, and the kidneys back from the heart, and the digestive system, and the liver back from the heart. We also have deoxygenated blood coming from the head and the arms into the right side of the heart. And then the right side of the heart pumps it to the lungs. And the lungs is where carbon dioxide is dropped off. And oxygen is picked up. So now the blood is oxygenated, and the blood goes back to the left side of the heart, which is the bigger pumping part of the heart. And the left side of the heart pumps it out through the great vessel, which is called the aorta. And this oxygenated blood goes to the liver, and it goes to the digestive system, and it goes to the kidneys, and it goes to the legs, and it also goes to the head and the arms. So this is showing you a little bit more simplified about the left and the right side of the heart. And as I said, the right side of the heart deals mostly with oxygenated blood. There is one exception that we'll talk about. And the left side of the heart deals with oxygenated blood, and its job is to deliver the oxygenated blood to the cells. And the right side of the heart's job is to deliver the deoxygenated blood to the lungs. And in the lungs, of course, is where the blood becomes oxygenated in the CO2. So at this point, there's a video that if you're watching the, if you're looking at the presentation, you need to watch that video. It's a good video. And again, this is showing you. Now, one thing I will point out here is that these places here, these are capillary beds. And so what would actually happen is that this oxygenated blood would go to capillary beds in the head and arms, and capillary beds in the liver and the gut and in the lower body. And then it would deliver its oxygen, and the CO2 gets picked up, and then we go into venules and veins, and then back. So you should have a coloring sheet that looks something like this. So I want you to, you can color along with me. We're going to start on the right side of the heart, and we're going to color this blue, and this part of the heart is blue as well. And then we're going to go into the two lungs. These are both going to be blue. This is deoxygenated blood, okay? But the at this point, what is happening is that the CO2 goes off and the oxygen goes in. So we have two lungs, CO2 goes off and oxygen goes in. And at this point, the blood is now oxygenated. So the oxygenated blood goes back through some blood vessels into the left side of the heart. So this is all oxygenated blood, and this is up through the aorta. And so these big arteries, because arteries carry oxygenated blood, go up to the head and the limbs, and it also goes through arteries to the liver, to the intestine, to the kidneys, and to the legs, and to the lower half of the body. Obviously, this is talking about an animal. It talks about tails. And remember, in these capillary beds, the blood is becomes deoxygenated. And so now I'm going to color it blue. And so now this blood is deoxygenated. It's coming from this little part right here is actually a special little shunt called the hepatic portal system, but that's for a more advanced class. And then we have a deoxygenated blood coming from the head and the forearms, and so that completes our circuit. So you should have a drawing something like this. So the heart itself has its own blood supply, because the heart itself is actually muscle. And the heart muscle itself is made of muscle called myocardium. So that is a muscle. It is a very hard-working muscle. And because of that, it has its own blood supply. And so we'll learn more about this, but the blood vessels that you see on the surface of the heart are called coronary arteries. And there are coronary arteries and there are also coronary veins. And the arteries carry oxygenated blood to the heart, and the veins carry deoxygenated blood away. And you might say, well, why does the heart need its own blood vessels? It's actually pumping the blood itself. But this is actually supplying the actual tissue of the heart itself. And as we'll learn, if the blood doesn't get there, this is what can cause a heart attack. So we have 4 main chambers in the heart. We have 2 upper chambers called the atria, and we have 2 lower chambers called the ventricles. So to take a look at the blood vessels coming in, let's talk about those. So there is a big, huge vein that is coming from the upper part of your body that is called the superior vena cava. That is the biggest vein in the body, and the inferior vena cava. So you remember superior and inferior. And this is carrying deoxygenated blood up from the legs. This is carrying deoxygenated blood down from the arms. And this is going to flow into the right atrium. And so the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava flow into the right atrium. The other blue veins that you see these are called pulmonary arteries that go from the right side of the heart to the lungs. So these are the lungs right here, and we're seeing the blood vessels in the lungs. And these pulmonary arteries are the only artery, because an artery is the blood vessel that leaves the heart, that carry deoxygenated blood. So it has not gone to the lungs yet, so that's why it's blue. So you have to remember this. This is the only artery that carries deoxygenated blood. So in the lungs, of course, it picks up oxygen, and now we have veins that are going back to the left atrium over here, but these are called veins because they are bringing blood to the heart. But this is an exception because the pulmonary veins are actually bringing oxygenated blood. So the pulmonary vein is the only vein that carries oxygenated blood. So these are 2 exceptions that you need to keep. So the pathway of the blood goes something like this. We have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava coming into the right atrium. This is looking at a cross section of the heart. The right atrium goes through a valve, and we'll talk about what the name of that is. A valve is just kind of a one-way door to keep it from flowing backwards. And then we have the right ventricle. The ventricles are always larger than the atria. And the ventricle is going to pump out the right side through a blood vessel called the pulmonary artery to the lungs. Then, when the blood comes back from the lungs, it is now called a vein, but it's oxygenated blood. And so it's going to go back into the left atrium over here. By the way, this is the right and left of the patient, so you can keep that in mind. This is the left side. And it's going to go through another valve into the left ventricle and then goes up through another valve. I forgot to talk about these valves, but that's okay. I'll give you the names in a minute. And it goes out through the aorta. And the aorta goes through the rest of the body. So let's see if we can draw all these on your drawing. You should have something that looks like this. So I'm going to color blue for deoxygenated. So here is my superior vena cava, and here is my inferior vena cava coming up here and coming down in here. And this would be my right atrium. Now the blood is going to go through a valve. And this valve right here is called the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is the valve between the right atria and the right ventricle. So when the blood goes through the tricuspid valve, it goes into the right ventricle. Then the right ventricle contracts and it goes through another valve, and these valves are called AV valves. AV valves. Sometimes they're called semilunar valves because I think they must have looked like a little half moon to the people. So this is the semilunar atrioventricular valve. And now this is going to the pulmonary artery, right? But it's still carrying deoxygenated blood, pulmonary artery, and these are going to the lungs. So remember, the lungs are over here. So here's a lung, and here's a lung over here. They get oxygenated, they drop off the CO2, and now I have oxygenated blood that comes back through these blood vessels, and these are the pulmonary veins, but they're carrying oxygenated blood. Remember, this is the exception. So these pulmonary veins, this one goes behind the heart, and then it goes into the left atrium. And the left atrium pumps through another valve right here. This valve is called the bicuspid or the mitral valve. And then the blood goes into the left ventricle. And the left ventricle pumps a mighty pump, and the blood goes through the last valve. And this is another AV valve. This is another AV valve, or another AV semilunar valve. Also, this is called the aortic valve, because it's going between the left ventricle and the aorta. And now this is the biggest blood vessel in the body. This is the aorta, and the blood is now going to be delivered to all of the arteries. So here's how the heart works. As it turns out, the atria contract together. So here's blood from the body and blood from the lungs, and these two atria are going to contract together, and blood is going to go through the respective valves into the ventricles. When the atria contract, the ventricles are relaxed that they can fill. So now what happens is that these valves are going to shut so the blood doesn't go backwards. And so now these ventricles are filling, and the atria have contracted now to squeeze the blood. And so now what's going to happen is that the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve are going to shut. And now what's going to happen is the ventricles are going to contract, and the blood is going to go out through the aorta and out through the pulmonary artery. And the atria are now going to relax and begin to fill, and the cycle is going to. So here's a pathway. This is a circle. It doesn't matter where you start, but this is kind of a diagram that tells you where the flowing. So there is a video that is embedded in this slide now that's going to give you a good review of the pathway of the heart, of the pathway of the blood in the heart. And I suggest that you watch that. This is an awesome Khan Academy video that's also talking about the valves in the heart and the different parts of the heart. So you should watch that as well. And you should be able to answer these questions to yourself. Ventricle systole. So ventricle systole means when the chamber is contracting, all right? And ventricle diastole is when the ventricle is relaxing. So remember, the two ventricles on one side and the other are going to contract and relax together. Atrial systole and atrial diastole, I bet you can figure that out, right? If you know what systole and diastole mean, and atrial just means it's happening in the atrial. So this is an awesome, just very short little video about an actual beating heart during open surgery. You should definitely watch that. And now we're going to talk about the wiring system of the heart. So the heart it beats on its own rhythm. It can be influenced by lots of different things, the chemistry of the blood. It can be affected by emotions. It can be affected by the level of oxygen and CO2 in the blood. But there is a pacemaker in the heart called the sinoatrial node, or the SA node of the heart. And it's a special type of electrical wiring system that stimulates the heart to contract. And it is the heart's natural pacemaker, the SA node. So it's going to stimulate the electrical signal. And it's going to go through some neurons, some wiring. This is actually in the right atrium. And then it gets kind of a booster shot in a second node or collection of electrical tissue called the AV node. So the signal now goes to the AV node, and the AV node is going to send the electrical signal down through the wall between the right and this would be the right ventricle, and this is the left ventricle. This is called the septum. This is called the septum. And these are called the bundles of His. So the electrical signal goes down through the septum, and then it branches into bundle branches on the right and the left, and then into these smaller little nerve pathways that are called Purkinje fibers. And this is what then stimulates the heart tissue. So a normal electrical conduction is going to start with the SA node, and then it goes to the AV node, which is in the bottom of this is all in the right atrium, and then the electrical signal goes to the septum of the heart, through the bundle of His, the right and left bundle branches, and then it would branch more into the Purkinje fibers, and that is what is going to signal the heart. So this is a video that talks about the electrical, and you should watch that. This is a funny picture. This is the original EKG machine, electrocardiogram. So this was cardio spelled with a K, electrocardiogram. And sometimes I think in some places over in Europe they call it an ECG, electrocardiogram. But anyway, an electrocardiogram is an instrument that measures the electrical signal coming from the heart. And you see this guy has got this contraption here, and he's got one leg in some liquid and probably has some electrolytes in it, and he's got his left and right arm in there. We don't do this today, but this is just interesting. This was the way that they figured out that they could measure the electrical signal. So a normal electrical signal, or an EKG, looks like this. We have a P wave, draw in red. We have a P wave, and then we have a QRS complex, and then we have a T wave. And as it turns out, this P wave is the signal for atrial depolarization. So that means the electrical signal is going to the heart to contract. This big QRS complex is the signal for ventricular depolarization. So this is the signal that goes to the ventricles to contract. And then the T wave is actually ventricular repolarization. So this is the electrical signal as it kind of resets itself. So if you're paying attention, you might say, oh, Mrs. Foy, I don't see a signal for atrial repolarization. And as it turns out, the signal for atrial repolarization is there, but it is just overshadowed by a larger electrical signal, the QRS complex that makes the ventricle. So if you think that you've had a heart attack, or they want to check to make sure that you haven't, you will go to your doctor's office or to the hospital, and they will put, depending on how accurate, they will put a bunch of different electrodes on your body in different places, sometimes your legs and your arms, and you will lie still, and then there is an EKG machine that measures the electrical signal of your heart. And we're going to actually do this in class. You can count the number of heartbeats here by the number of the QRS complex that you have. And cardiologists and trained people, electrical signal, how healthy your heart is. So this is also a great little video that kind of summarizes the electricals in the heart. So that's it, and I will see you in class. There's more lecture to come, but that's for another day.